Good morning. Today is the 29th of Nisan, and tomorrow is the first day of Rosh Chodesh Nisan. And we're also in the 7th of May. We're up to the third reading of Parshat Kedoshim. And at the very end of the third reading, first of all, we find a repetition that is usually not noticed. So I point you to Leviticus 19:30, and the verse reads, "You must observe my Sabbath, and you must revere my sanctuary. I am God." Now, if we go back to the very beginning of Kedoshim, and the beginning of this chapter, 19:3, we find something very interesting. 19:3 reads, "You must respect your mother and father, and you must observe my Sabbath. I, Havaya, am God, am your God." So the whole difference between these two verses is that in the first time, in verse 3, it says that you shall respect, you must honor your father and mother, or respect your father and mother. And in verse 30, it's "you shall revere my sanctuary." But what's common to both of them is the observance of the Sabbath. Okay? So there's a very interesting connection between, or almost a parallel, between the sanctuary, the place of God's presence, and one's parents. And this is something that we discuss a lot, that there's a statement from the Bnei Yisachar, the Reb Tzvi Elimelech of Dinov. He was a fifth generation Hasidic Rebbe, and he was a tremendous scholar. He wrote a Hasidic commentary on all 613 commandments, and he held by the idea that a person should know the 613 commandments by heart, which is, by the way, shared by many people, that this is one of the things a person should know by heart. And so in his Hasidic work, what he did was, he did two things. He wrote a shortened version of the 613 commandments so that you could repeat it every day until you knew it by heart, something that takes about 15 minutes to read. And he also wrote a lengthy commentary, and in his lengthy commentary he writes a very important thing about respecting and honoring one's parents. He says, the reason that we respect and honor our parents is not because they are respectable or honorable people. Meaning it's not by virtue of who they are, but by virtue of their relationship to us. And he says, what is this like? He says, one's parents are like the place of God's sanctuary. He connects the two together. He says, God's sanctuary was built on the place from which the world was created. What exactly that means and how to understand that statement from the sages, we're not going to get into right now. But the sages say that this is where this is where man was created, the place of the altar on Mount Moriah, where the tabernacle, where the temple was built, is the place from which Adam was created. This is like the earth from which he was created. And the place on which the Holy of Holies is, the sanctuary, is the place from which the world was created. It's like that this is the central point of the universe. It's a whole question in science, is there such a thing? Right? Special general relativity would have us believe that there is no real center to the universe. There is no privileged perspective from which to look at everything else as being around you. But in the Torah, there is such a privileged perspective, whether you're talking about the earth, or you're talking about the land of Israel, or you're talking about the solar system, or you're talking about everything, the entire universe. There is a place that has a privileged perspective. It doesn't mean the center doesn't necessarily mean that everything revolves around you. In fact, that would be a mistake to think that. What it really means is that from this vantage point, you see things that you can't see from somewhere else, that you will never be able to see from somewhere else. In any case, so he says, the parents are like the sanctuary because they represent the point of your entry into the world. For your concerns, the world was created from your parents. Your world started from them. And so we have here a very interesting threesome when you think about it. We have here space, a place in the world, the sanctuary. We have time being mentioned twice. Et shabtotai tishmoru. You shall observe my Sabbath, both in verse 3 and in verse 30. And we have honoring our parents, which is really honoring the point from which our soul enters the world. So we have here space, time, and soul. The three dimensions that we usually talk about when considering anything in this world, in these two verses. And again, the common theme is to observe the Sabbath. And it seems to equate the sanctuary with the parents. So that's a thought about what does it mean to respect and honor our parents, which is the same in a certain sense as respecting and honoring the sanctuary, the temple of all mankind, which is meant to say there is a central point from which I start. I'm not just some kind of relativistic, parentless, pastless being floating around here. I have a starting point. And so from that we can gather something very interesting. That just as the sanctuary is the starting point of reality, and my parents are my starting point, my figurative center of my universe, so the Sabbath is the beginning of time. It's the center of time. Again, in the sense that it gives meaning to everything around it. That's why many times we find that the 6 days, the 6 weekdays, are called Yemei HaHekif, the days that surround. And what do we mean by surround? That you take the Sabbath as a center, and then you put 6 coins around it. So you have 1 coin in the center and 6 around it, 7 coins altogether, 7 days of the week. But here we see as the 6 days, the 6 weekdays, surrounding the center point of the Sabbath. What that means is that the Sabbath gives you in time the grounding, the centering that your parents give you in terms of your psychology, and that the sanctuary, God's temple, gives you in terms of orienting yourself in space, and saying that there is a place to which I churn always. And so if a person doesn't have these 3 elements, these 3 very important centering, orienting aspects to his 3 dimensions, space, time, and soul, the person feels disconnected. And so interestingly, in verse 30, just before that it says, you must not defile your unmarried daughter by making her a prostitute, lest the land engage in prostitution and the land be filled with immorality. This is verse 29. The verse before, you shall observe my Sabbath and sanctify my sanctuary. Here we're talking about space. And so it says, if you as a parent you also have a duty to give your children this feeling of being centered, of being grounded, of having an orientation. When you don't do that, you will cause your daughter to prostitute. What do we mean by prostitute? Again, it's a girl or a person who has lost their grounding, who has lost their ability to find a center point that guides them, to have a compass, an inner compass, a feeling that there is somewhere that I'm going. And in fact, in Hebrew, The word to prostitute, to make someone prostitute, lechalel, is the same word that means to make someone profane. Without holiness, and again, the meaning here is that holiness is what grounds us in the world. It grounds us in space, in time, and in soul. And so in space, like we said, it's the sanctuary. In time, it's the Sabbath. And in soul, it's our parents. So if the parents don't fulfill their duty, it's as if they've taken away this grounding from their child. Then the land itself is filled with immorality. Space, all space around me is filled with immorality. I don't see the world orienting itself in a positive direction. I see space as being something that's always relative, always not clear about what belongs to whom, and where is one person, where is the other person. Everything seems to be confused, like a prostitute. There's nothing belongs to anyone. It's like this feeling of I've been torn out of the ground from which I grow. That's the feeling of immorality. And so again, this parsha, which is all about being holy, is in these two verses, which again they're like a repetition of one another, verse 3 and 30. They're aiming at creating grounding holiness, something that allows a person to find themselves, to find their path, to feel that they're not disconnected. So thanks for joining today. Hope to see you tomorrow.